The neuroscience of spirituality and religious experience is a fascinating subject. In this episode, I interview Dr. Andrew Newberg about the brain, spirituality, and religion. Even if you're not particularly spiritual, or if you, like me, don't believe in God, spirits, the soul, or the afterlife, it's still fascinating to understand that the brain is naturally wired for profound experiences and the effect they have on our health and well-being. In this episode, we primarily discuss Dr. Newberg's 2012 teaching company course, The Spiritual Brain. Andrew Newberg is currently the research director at the Marcus Institute of Integrative Health at Thomas Jefferson University and Hospital in Philadelphia. He is a professor in the Department of Integrative Medicine and Nutritional Sciences with a secondary appointment in the Department of Radiology at Thomas Jefferson University. He is board certified in internal medicine and in nuclear medicine. He has actively pursued a number of neuroimaging research projects, which have included the study of aging and dementia and epilepsy and other neurologic and psychiatric disorders. Dr. Newberg has been particularly involved in the study of mystical and religious experiences, a field referred to as neurotheology. He's published over 250 peer-reviewed articles and chapters on brain function, brain imaging, and the study of religious and mystical experiences. He's published 12 books, which have been translated into 17 different languages. He was listed as one of the 30 most influential neuroscientists alive today by the Online Psychology Degree Guide. All right, well, without further ado, I give you my conversation with Dr. Andrew Newberg. All right, well, I will have read your full bio for the audience, but maybe you can just give a little bit of background on why you decided to study the brain and religion and spirituality.
Sure. Well, I think a lot of it really goes back to when I was a kid. I was always very fascinated by the issues that came up with me when I was kind of, looking at the world and wondering why there were different religions, different political parties, and so forth. To me, I sort of felt like, well, if we're all looking at the same world, how come we don't all have the same conclusions? And I realized, well, the starting point has to be the human brain, because that's what ultimately is taking in all the information out there in the world and processing it and using our emotions and thoughts and things like that. But as I studied the brain and as I learned more and more about how the brain worked, I realized that there were certain limitations that science had in terms of trying to understand some of these big questions about consciousness and things like that. And realized that it was important to take into consideration other perspectives, like philosophical perspectives or spiritual perspectives. And as I started to study those approaches, to me, this whole sort of process, this whole journey became much more contemplative. It became very, I spent a lot of time really thinking about this issue about what is sort of I guess the big question, what's the nature of reality and how do we know it? And then finally, when I was in medical school, I had the very good fortune of working with two wonderful mentors, one who was in the world of brain imaging, who taught me about doing functional brain imaging, and we did studies on very traditional stuff like Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's and depression and things like that. And then I also met a second mentor who was a psychiatrist at the University of Pennsylvania, where I was in medical school. And we began to, and he had been exploring the questions about the relationship between spirituality or religion and the brain, really dating back to the 1970s. So all of this happened back in like the early 1990s. And we started thinking about the parts of the brain that are involved in religious and spiritual practices and beliefs and so forth. And then finally, as I like to say, the sort of, the proverbial light bulb went off. And I said, well, wait, if we're using brain scans to look at Alzheimer's and depression, why can't we use it to look at religion and spirituality? And that was really what kind of launched us into this sort of broader world of neurotheology and trying to understand the relationship between the brain and our religious and spiritual selves. And it really is, at least in my view, I know we'll talk about this in more detail, but it really is a kind of combined scientific as well as spiritual journey. It's a path that kind of requires both perspectives. And so for me, it's just the continuation of those very basic questions that I asked many, many years ago as a kid and still trying to kind of figure it out. So that's really what has kind of led me to where I am today, and continuing to explore these kinds of questions.
Wow, it's a really interesting journey, really, really cool synthesis of those two different areas. Well, as you mentioned, you study the brain and the neuroscience of spirituality and among other things, but spirituality and religious practices are something you've studied from a neuroscientific perspective. Um, and I'm wondering if you can define those terms. What does it mean? How would you define spiritual or religious?
So the overall field, as I mentioned, I usually refer to as neurotheology, and of course there are other possible names for that as well. But part of what that's really all about is studying that relationship between the brain and our religious and spiritual selves. But about 10 years ago, I wrote a book called Principles of Neurotheology, and one of the first chapters is really about definitions. And it's very important to think about the definitions for a whole array of concepts. And you mentioned the first two, obviously religion and spirituality, but soul, spirit, God, there's a lot of different possible types of definitions that we should think about. But and to a certain extent, especially when it comes to any of these definitions, it's always important for each person. So every listener, needs to think about them for themselves to a certain extent, not to cop out on the answer, but everybody kind of defines these terms a little bit differently. But I think and what's interesting is that there's, for spirituality and religiousness, I mean, there's certainly a lot of overlap. A lot of people who are religious are also spiritual. And typically the spiritual tends to refer a little bit more to the personal experience, and the pursuit of something kind of greater than the selves, very, very broadly defined. Religion's one of the defining characteristics, I guess, is that there's a group of people who say this is what it means to be Jewish, Catholic, whatever. So they kind of identify what it is and what it means. But there's a lot of overlap. And when I do these kinds of exercises with students, I say, how would you define these terms? Somebody will say, well, spirituality is the experience of it. Somebody else, well, wait a minute, religion, there's religious experience too. Somebody say, well, it's about the individual versus the group. But then somebody will say, but wait a minute, spirituality can also be a group. It could be a group of people meditating. And then religion often can be, one person sitting in their room praying or something like that. So there gets to be this great overlap. And actually, when you look at surveys of people and how they describe themselves, as I mentioned, probably like if you look at the United States, maybe about 2/3 or so will say that they are both religious and spiritual. But you have a growing group of individuals, maybe about 20%, who say that they are spiritual but not religious. They don't want to feel that they're tied to a given tradition, but they're searching. They're trying to understand a greater meaning and purpose in life. They're trying to understand their connection to something greater than the self. So that has that spiritual piece to it, which is not necessarily part of a formalized approach that might be called a religion. And of course, you have people who are religious and not spiritual, which is interesting. I think one of the types of people that I sometimes think about in that context are, for example, like a cultural Jewish individual who, doesn't necessarily believe in the religion, doesn't believe even in God per se, but follows a lot of the precepts and does follows the Sabbath, maybe keeps the laws of kosher or something like that, because it's part of what connects them to their family or to their community along those lines. And then, of course, the fourth category are the people who are more atheistic or agnostic, who will say, I'm neither religious nor spiritual. And then and the last thing I'll say about this is that, even when it comes to an atheist, a lot of people do have a spiritual sense, which is not necessarily a supernatural sense. So it could be something through music or creativity or, taking a walk in the mountains or something like that and feeling connected to nature. All of ways of kind of connecting to ourselves and connecting to the universe in ways that are different, but not necessarily invoking something which is truly supernatural. So, again, this is, we in fact, the next book that I have coming out is going to be called The Varieties of Spiritual Experience. And here again, we're going to be using a lot of people's descriptions and narratives about what they mean by spirituality and what is the broad array of what spirituality is all about. So we understand it a little bit, but it's a massive area, a massive field of scholarship, and a lot more needs to be learned.
That's very cool, and that title is harkens back to William James, right? Okay.
Right. And I mean, that was really what started it. Was we wanted to do kind of a, an updated version, if you will, of the William James varieties of religious experience about 100 years ago. And here we now have 100 years of new information and brain scans and surveys and all kinds of data and scientific approaches that really have advanced a lot of what he was talking about. So this gives us kind of this new perspective. And we decided to go with spiritual experiences because we wanted to explain how it could be even broader than what James was actually talking about. So
Great. Yeah, well, that's a good foundation for us to lay, because the bulk of what I want to ask you about today is really what the brain is doing, what it looks like during specific spiritual practices, whether that's prayer or mindfulness meditation or other forms of meditation. So I'm wondering if we can just kind of jump into that. I guess we could start with how prayer and mindfulness are different in the brain, or maybe just what are some of the prominent changes that occur with perhaps short-term or long-term prayer or meditation. I know that's kind of a monster of a question, but I'll let you tackle it.
that may take us the rest of the show, actually.
Yeah, good.
Well, I think there's a couple of overarching points, and we'll start with that, and then we can get into whatever details you'd like. First of all, I think an important point is that all of the data to me points to the fact that there's not just one part of our brain that is the spiritual part of our brain. There's not one part of our brain that lights up or turns on or whatever when we meditate or pray. It ultimately is many different parts of the brain. And that really shouldn't come as a huge surprise to people, I think, because when you actually think about the practices that people do, the beliefs that they hold, they involve a lot of different things. And what I mean by that is, somebody could be spiritual and it's a very emotional process for them. Somebody could be spiritual and it's a very cognitive, they're thinking about consciousness and the world in certain ways, meaning and purpose. It could be experiential, something that they felt or perceived when they were in nature or when they were meditating or praying or something like that. So we have our experiences, all the different emotions that we have, a whole array of different possible cognitive processes that might be part of that. And so depending on what a person is doing and thinking and feeling, we would expect to see different kinds of changes. And again, to just give like a specific example to that, if somebody is meditating on a prayer, for example, versus meditating on the image of a candle, for example, they're going to activate different parts of the brain. The person meditating on the prayer is going to be activating the verbal areas of the brain. And we've seen this with some of our brain scan studies. The person who's looking at a candle or imagining, the image of a candle is going to activate the visual areas of the brain. So there, depending on exactly what somebody's doing, there could be a lot of different kinds of changes that are going on in the brain. Now, ultimately, they may both feel a sense of joy, they may feel a sense of oneness. And if they both feel that sense of oneness, we might expect to see the same brain areas being involved. But again, even that could be distinct if the oneness is with God versus the universe versus with consciousness or something like that. So part of what we've been doing over the last 20 to 30 years is studying a whole array of different kinds of practices and the experiences that come out of those practices so that we can try to better understand which parts of the brain are involved. But as I mentioned, I think maybe the simplest way of answering your question is that it really can involve almost the entire brain. All the different parts of our brain get involved. And I'm in a center of integrative medicine, so our brain is intimately connected with our body. And so, and there's been some really interesting discussions and models that have, including our own, which incorporates the autonomic nervous system that regulates our kind of arousal and as well as our calming or quiescent sides of our body. And they all get involved. So if there's kind of a spiritual part of ourselves, it's our whole self, and that to me is what's very exciting and has generally fallen out of all of the research that we have done looking at these kinds of brain scan studies.
That's really fascinating. Yeah. So I guess, well, would you say, is there any kind of prominent common change that occurs across these practices that is distinct to spirituality or religion, as opposed to anything else we could be doing with our brains?
Sure. Well, one of the books that we wrote was How Enlightenment Changes Your Brain, which tried to focus on some of these more intense experiences. And one of the things that we kind of came to in exploring not just all of our brain scans, but the qualitative experiences that people have and the descriptions of those experiences, we came up with about 5 core elements of these spiritual experiences. And to just step back before we get into that in a little bit more detail, one of the important points about all of this is that there does seem to be something about these experiences that people identify as spiritual. So, there is this distinction that seems to occur in our brain that says, I just had something that was a spiritual experience, which is distinguished from what our everyday reality kinds of experiences are. So then the question is, well, what is it exactly? Especially if we're still using the same parts of our brain. And I think that was where we got into thinking about this from the perspective of several core components of these experiences. So this is not in any particular order, but one of them is a sense of oneness that we mentioned a few minutes ago. So that sense of being connected to something greater than the self, God, the universe, or whatever. The area of the brain that we think is involved in this most likely is an area of the brain in the back part, the parietal lobe, which normally takes our sensory information and helps us to create our spatial representation of ourself. And so we had proposed many years ago that when people engage in a meditation practice, part of what happens to them is that they preferentially decrease the activity in this parietal lobe. So if the area normally turns on to give us our sense of self, then as it starts to quiet down, we lose that sense of self. We lose the boundary between ourself and the rest of the world. And that's exactly what we've seen in these experiences, that there's a decrease of parietal lobe activity. And of course, again, I think ultimately there's a continuum, because we can lose ourselves in music or painting or something like that. But this seems to be a more profound, sense of oneness that overwhelms the person. And that's maybe leads into the second component, which is what I would refer to as the sense of intensity. There's something about these experiences that are beyond our everyday reality experiences. These are the most whatever experience that a person has had, the most beautiful music, the most intense feeling of oneness, the most powerful feeling of love, whatever it is. And when we look at these descriptions that people have, they use words like that, infinite, most powerful, incredible. So clearly there's something intense about these experiences. And while we're not entirely sure where that comes from in the brain, one of the main areas that we've been looking at is the limbic system. So the limbic system is involved in our emotions, and turns on when anything of importance happens in the world. So so it makes sense then that these areas of the brain, which not only signify what's important to us, but ultimately write those into our memory as something that's very important for us to remember. We think that has a lot to do with the limbic system, and the limbic system in particular has been activated during a lot of these kinds of practices. So we have a sense of unity, we have a sense of intensity. The third component is a sense of clarity, and what that is that's where people say, for the first time in my life, I get it. Like, I understand the world, I understand who I am, I understand God, whatever it is. It's like they get it now. They have a new way of thinking about the world. It's often a kind of paradigmatic shift for them, and which actually is another component that we'll talk about in a second, which is this transformation. But in the moment, everything becomes clear to the person. And again, we're not entirely sure, but one of the areas of the brain that we think may be particularly involved in this is a very central structure called the thalamus. And that helps to connect different parts of the brain to each other. It helps to bring sensory information up into the brain. And so we think the thalamus may be particularly relevant in helping people kind of rework the ways in which they think about the world and create that sense of clarity. But that sense of clarity could be an emotional sense of clarity. It could be a cognitive, it could be both, but certainly something that makes it very clear for the person. The fourth component is a sense of surrender, for lack of a better term. What we mean by this is that the person, may have been going down a path, like we were talking about myself, exploring a question, meditating, praying, following a religion or something like that. But eventually, when you get to this experience of enlightenment, you feel like you are taken over by the experience. You're not making it happen. It's something that's happening to you. You're kind of along for the ride, as they would say. And where we think that goes on is in the frontal lobes. So when we start a meditation practice or do a prayer practice and we're concentrating on it, the frontal lobes typically become more active. And we've seen that in our brain scan studies. But when somebody has an experience where they surrender themselves, where they kind of give their own willfulness and purposefulness over to the experience, then their frontal lobes actually shut down. And again, we've seen that occur in a number of practices where that is the principal experience. Like in Islamic prayer, the whole concept of Islam is to surrender oneself. And so when you surrender to God, the frontal lobe structures begin to quiet down. And we see that as part of what's going on in the brain of those individuals. And so that is the fourth very important component. And then the fifth component, which isn't so much part of the experience itself, those first four are actually like the experience itself, but it's sort of the aftermath, which is the transformation. It changes who the person is fundamentally. And one of the things that we did in this survey that we had of about 2,000 experiences, we asked people, what changes occurred as the result of having this experience. And, close to 90% of people would tell you that their sense of meaning and purpose improved, their sense of spirituality and religiousness improved. They no longer feared death. Their relationships got better. Their health got better. So, they felt like it was an overwhelming shift in who they were. And this transformational element, component of these experiences, to me, is also a really important part of what these experiences are all about. So, you have, and it kind of came up in the book, how enlightenment changes your brain, because enlightenment has kind of two meanings. One is the moment, which is, what does a person feel when it happens? But then you can be in a state of enlightenment. You can have this sort of perpetual change in who you are as an individual. And that again, gets kind of borne out, even in some of our brain scan studies. You asked about this a little while ago, where, we see changes in the moment of the practice, but then we also see changes that occur on a more permanent basis, even when the brain is at rest and not meditating or praying. There are changes in the brain when people go through these experiences.
Wow, and that's fascinating, because the Enlightenment experiences must be on a kind of the extreme end of these spiritual experiences. Like, not everybody who meditates or prays the first time is going to have one of these.
Right.
But I mean, and I want to return to your point about the frontal lobes in just a little bit. But to your point about these kind of more permanent changes, and maybe more on the side of normal range of meditative experiences, normal sorts of meditation. In your course, The Spiritual Brain, which was back from 2012, so this will be more than 10 years old, I guess, at this point.
Hard to believe.
It doesn't sound that way, by the way. I think
I know.
definitely recommend it to people. So I just wanted to quote something you said from it when you're talking about a study that you were involved in, where you had participants doing a particular form of meditation called Kirtan Kriya.
Right.
And so you had them do it, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, but once a day for 8 weeks, and
Correct.
It takes about 12 minutes to do it.
That's right.
And it showed improvements in verbal memory, I believe, decreases in stress, anxiety, and depression, and then increased resting frontal lobe activity.
Correct.
Okay.
That's correct. Yep.
And you said, so I'm just going to quote you here. You said, If a secular version of a meditation practice that people did for only 12 minutes a day for 8 weeks caused these kinds of changes, can you imagine the changes that occur when people engage in a truly meaningful religious or spiritual practice for years and years? The effects should be incredibly profound. So,
Correct.
yeah, so I just guess wanted to discuss that a little bit, and then
Sure.
I've got a couple follow-up questions for you on that one.
Yeah. Well, no, I mean that, to a certain extent, what we were just talking about, there's, but you're bringing up an interesting differentiation, so to speak. One is, what is the benefit of doing a practice for long periods of time, and how does that change us over long periods of time? And in many ways it does. And the Kirtan Kriya study that we did, documented that over that, 2 month period, which is what led us to say, gee, imagine, what a monk or a nun who's doing deeply religious meditation or practices for hours a day for 20, 30 years. It's really going to change the way their brain operates. And again, we have seen evidence for that. But what, so one of the answers to your question too is that, a lot of people who are thinking about this need to try to figure out exactly what their goals are of a practice. And, when we did the Kirtan Kriya study, it was really just about reducing stress and improving cognition. And so doing a simple practice like that can actually have a pretty dramatic effect on that. For people who are striving for enlightenment, for spiritual, to get to some kind of spiritual experience, mystical experience or something like that, here, one of the things I think we have to differentiate is the meditation or the practice or the prayer practice itself versus the experience that might arise out of it. And so somebody could, as you were mentioning earlier, I mean, somebody could meditate for many, many years and never achieve enlightenment. Other people may meditate for very short periods of time and have some kind of very intense experience. So on one hand, we never know exactly when they're going to occur. And what our ongoing data has showed is that these practices do help to facilitate changes in the brain that facilitate or predispose us to these experiences. And actually, one of the studies that we did more recently was where we sent people through a spiritual retreat program. It was a very immersive, very intense program. It was relatively short. It was about a 1 week program that was based off of the spiritual exercises of Saint Ignatius, the founder of the Jesuit tradition. And we actually did a study looking not just at areas of the brain and in terms of brain activity, but we looked at different neurotransmitters. And what we found was that the brain became more sensitive to the effects of neurotransmitters such as dopamine and serotonin. So
Wow.
that means that if they have a release of dopamine in the brain, their brain's going to have a greater response. And dopamine does cause this very positive emotional kind of response, as does serotonin. So, getting back to your question then, what we think is happening is that these practices, especially when it has a great deal of meaning for the person, when it's something that the person does over and over again, really changes the brain in very dramatic ways. It can have, more clinically oriented effects in terms of cognition, emotional regulation, and so forth. And there's a lot of other studies that have looked at, practices like mindfulness, for example, and showed its ability to help people regulate their emotions. But again, I think it also helps to predispose people to having very intense spiritual experiences, because it kind of primes the brain. It sets it up so that you can have this very powerful kind of experience. And theoretically, the more you do the practice, the more likely you may be of having those kinds of experiences.
Wow, that is incredible. That point about the neurotransmitters, it just never occurred to me that that would be possible. But I guess I got a couple different questions on that one. I guess we'll start with this one. So, if are there any examples you can think of people meditating on negative or damaging or even like evil ideas that lead them in a lead to negative consequences or anything like that? Kind of a
Yeah.
odd question, but
Well, no, actually, it's a really important question that has not gotten a lot of attention yet, and is something that I actually hope is a real important part of the future of neurotheology as a field, which is the negative side of things. And we know that there's negativity that occurs. You're talking about something very specific about actually purposely meditating on something negative. And we'll talk about that in a second. But certainly people can have very negative views about God. We see this in the healthcare setting sometimes when people get cancer, or that they feel God is punishing them because of their immoral behaviors from before. And of course, if somebody thinks that God is punishing them, then they're going to be less likely to want to try to get better or try to do therapies or whatever. So, and the same is true, with people with like psychiatric disorders, depression, substance abuse, and so forth. In fact, that's why some of the more powerfully effective therapies for substance abuse, like Alcoholics Anonymous, invokes this higher power concept and invokes this idea of sort of a spiritual part of the person, as a way of trying to help them to overcome whatever issues that they may be facing. So that's definitely an important part of it. But the idea of kind of actually actively striving for something more negative is interesting in and of itself. And I think the two examples that I always think about, one are cults and cult behavior. Which, again, maybe for the person at the time, they feel like it's something very positive, but often, unfortunately, a lot of times they lead to very negative behaviors and sometimes committing mass suicide or something like that. We've seen those examples. And then the other, which is also, pretty prevalent in the world today, which are people who turn towards terrorism and violence and, destruction to, in the name of God, in the name of their particular spiritual or religious beliefs. And so, here too, I think, people are, what is it about those perspectives that may be intriguing for a given individual? What is it that, a person goes to the ISIS website and says, gee, that sounds good. I'd like to blow up people who don't believe the way I do. So, what is it about a person who kind of moves down that path? And is it something that, they move down that path right away? Is it something that occurs over time? And certainly we know that some of the ritualistic practices and so forth that are part of these approaches, cult behavior and terrorism and things like that, to kind of engender that experience and those beliefs can be very, very powerful. In fact, one of the quotes that I often go back to from my old mentor and one of the early work that we had done was that ritual is a morally neutral technology, and rituals have been used worldwide for wonderful things and bringing people together and singing and holding hands and creating a wonderful feeling of community and love, and also for to great ill and destruction. And whether it's the Nazis who used rituals extraordinarily effectively, or again what we see in cult behavior or other types of really negative behavior, what it ultimately is kind of doing, I think, is that it creates a sense of connection and a sense of oneness. Now, normally we think, okay, well, what's wrong with that? The issue or the answer to the question, what's wrong with that, is that I think a lot of time it has to do with what one feels connected to. And it doesn't have to be, you could be one person and feel connected to the world, and you could be a group of people and be only connected to the group. So again, it's not just what you are or in what context you are, but it's the beliefs themselves that are part of it. And if you feel that you are connected to all of humanity, then that ritual and those beliefs engender a sense of openness and oneness and connectedness, with everyone, and a sense of compassion to every person that you meet. On the other hand, if the ritual connects you only to the group, then that group becomes the reality for that individual. And so anything which is outside of that doesn't believe in that, that almost becomes an unreal thing. I mean, and for that individual, they might view that as unreal. They might view it as evil. And of course, if you now have somebody over there who's saying, no, you're wrong, I'm right, then they may look at that individual and say, no, that person needs to be destroyed, killed, whatever. That belief needs to be erased because it really represents something which is not real. And why would they keep saying it if it's not real? So I think, that to me is part and parcel of how this may occur, but it also obviously starts to engender fairly violent beliefs and behaviors in people. And we've started to think about this a little bit, but it really is intriguing to try to understand what those effects are, and goes back into even things like neurotransmitters, and how different parts of the brain are operating. that might lead somebody down a path that is truly negative versus those people who go down paths that are very positive. And hopefully this gives us an opportunity to find a way of, of thinking about how we can redirect people into more positive ways of thinking down the road.
Wow. Wow. Yeah. Dangerous stuff there. So the other thing I wanted to ask about regarding the Kirtan Kriya study and some of these other studies that you mentioned is you mentioned that you kind of secularized it and took out some of the more explicitly religious or mystical aspects of it. And I'm wondering if would that be able to be applied to a prayer, for instance? So will an atheist like myself doing a religious prayer get the same benefits as a believer? Will my brain look the same? I suppose it probably wouldn't, but is there any evidence that even very religious prayers done by someone who doesn't believe, would they still get a benefit from it?
Yeah, so we do have a little bit of evidence about that, and it even kind of comes back to the quote that you read out of the Spiritual Brain book or a video lecture series, which is that um, I guess the best way to answer your question is that the more a person believes in whatever it is that they're doing, the stronger the effect most likely is going to be. So, we did a research study on the rosary and showed that the rosary helped to reduce anxiety in people, but that's really only going to be true for people who are Catholic and who like to do the rosary. So you wouldn't tell a Jewish person or an atheist, hey, here's a research study that shows that the rosary reduces anxiety. You should do that, because it doesn't have any meaning to you. And again, the data would actually probably show just the opposite as well. I mean, we do know that when people can have what would be referred to as kind of a religious struggle, they're trying to think about something that they don't agree with, or they're struggling in their own mind about what's right and what's wrong, or what they should be doing or what they should be leaving, then you actually have an increase in stress and anxiety and depression for people. So, that's why I think it really does have to be tailored to a given individual, and whether that's secularizing a given practice for people who, are not of that tradition, like yoga classes and mindfulness and so forth, which can be done, pretty much by anybody, irrespective of, whatever beliefs or non-beliefs they may have. But again, we do have some brain scans where we had people just kind of do the practice, or do a practice that they don't really care about, versus do a practice that they really do care about, and do it very fully. And there's clearly much more of a shift in the brain function. So, it is something that a person really needs to connect with and feel good about. And, that probably shouldn't be a surprise. I mean, if people, if you like to listen to music to make you feel relaxed, if you don't like uh, heavy metal, then you wouldn't be listening to heavy metal to make you feel good about that. On the other hand, if you like heavy metal and somebody says, here, why don't you listen to this easy listening stuff, it's probably going to irritate you. So, so very much it has to do with where you're headed, what your own personal interests and beliefs and what you like and don't like, in terms of whatever stimuli or practices that you're going to do. So when I do talk to people about thinking about a practice, while most research has shown that these practices have been beneficial for people, I do tell them to take stock in who you are as a person. What do you like to do? What are your beliefs? What are your goals? And then try to find a practice that is consistent with that. And so, if you happen to be, a Catholic individual, then maybe doing the rosary on a daily basis would be a great thing for you. On the other hand, if you are an atheist, then searching for mindfulness or doing something out in nature or doing something creative will probably be far more beneficial for you, obviously, than doing something that has any kind of particular religious perspective.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That analogy to music hits home, because you just described my brother and I. He's a huge metal fan, and I'm more of an easy listening guy. So, kind of returning to some of these brain changes, you mentioned that especially during those Enlightenment experiences, that frontal lobe activity goes down, and that's correlated with a reduced sense of self. or I'm sorry, sense of what
Surrender.
surrender, correct.
Mhm.
So um, it is that generally the frontal lobes, or is there anything specific to the prefrontal cortex? Um, I'm interested because I'm doing a little project on the prefrontal cortex right now, and just want to get your perspective on that.
Yeah, I mean, it is a little bit more specific for the prefrontal cortex. But again, it depends a little bit too on what the person is doing. If it is a more verbally based practice, then it could include things like Broca's area, some of the language, production areas. If it's more about emotional regulation, it can be some of the inferior parts of the frontal lobe, but definitely the prefrontal cortex. We've always kind of talked about that as being a fundamentally important part. It helps to regulate emotional responses as far as the limbic system goes. So absolutely, I mean that's definitely a fundamental part of it.
Yeah. So is it it's interesting because is it the case that its activity always goes down during meditation or prayer? And I know those can be quite different from each other, but say during mindfulness meditation, does the PFC activity usually go down?
Well, yeah, I mean it can do either. It can go up if it's a very sort of a concentration based kind of practice. It can go down if it is more of just sort of letting yourself go. And it can fluctuate. And I mean that in and of itself is actually a really important concept I think that people sometimes miss when it comes to the discussion about meditation, which is that it's a dynamic process. And if you sit down to meditate right now and you meditate for an hour, what your brain is doing in the first 5 minutes of that hour is going to be completely different than what your brain is doing in the last 5 minutes of that hour, and where it may shift and so forth. And then again, you could have some really amazing experience at some point in the midst of all of that, and that can have a significant impact on what's going on in the brain and vice versa. So yeah, I mean, I think the frontal lobes are generally going to be involved, but exactly how and when and where, that does depend a little bit, or a lot of it, on what kind of practice you're doing and what the goals are and what you're experiencing.
That totally makes sense. A dynamic system, really. And
Yeah.
um,
In fact, I mean, just to pick up on that, I mean, in the Enlightenment book, I mean, what we proposed, and we haven't fully been able to prove this yet. But what we think is actually going on, it gets back to a little bit to this idea of the predisposition thing, which is that uh, what I think might be happening is that it's not so much where your brain is at a given moment in time, but how your brain is changing
hmm,
through that time period, through that dynamic process. And the example that I sometimes use is that like if you're sitting on in an airplane on the ground, you don't feel like anything's happening. If you're sitting in an airplane up at 35,000 feet, uh, barring turbulence, you don't really feel like you're moving very much. When do you feel you're moving? Well, you feel like you're moving when you're taking off or when you're landing, because there's a shift, there's the acceleration and the deceleration. That's when you feel something. So if that's the case for the brain, then it may not actually be whether the brain has an overactive frontal lobe or an underactive frontal lobe, but how it shifts. And if we think about that in the context of meditation practices, if meditation practices normally kind of ratchet up your frontal lobe function as you sort of go up, then at some point when you do finally kind of lose yourself or surrender yourself, it's coming way down and maybe goes even to the decreased activity territory. And again, another analogy that I sometimes use is that if you walk up like one step or two steps, then you jump down, not much happens. If you are standing on the edge of a pool that's been emptied and you jump 10 feet, you jump in and it's 10 feet down, um, you're going to feel something when you hit the ground. I mean, falling 10 feet is going to hurt. If you climb up a ladder 20 feet, or 10 feet, and then you jump down 10 feet, now you're falling 20 feet, and something really big is going to happen to you, usually bad in this case. But so in the context of the brain, if you increase the activity in the brain 10%, and then you go down to a drop of 10%, that's a 20% change in the brain. That's pretty substantial, and that may account for these kinds of experiences, the moment of that experience, that kind of takes you from one place to another in the practice. So that's part and parcel how we've been starting to think a little bit about this too, which is that, again, it's not just being in one place or another as far as your brain goes, but it may be the shifts of activity, the release of a dopamine, it's not just if there's dopamine there, but it's suddenly the influx of dopamine and the activation of those neurons, which is causing the change. Not just that the neurons are activated, but how they're kind of starting to turn themselves on.
Wow. Wow. That's very interesting. Kind of the acceleration points are really what matters. In the plane analogy there, the
Yeah.
acceleration and deceleration. That's very cool. So I guess so far we've been talking really about pretty much at the individual level, or the average, from studies looking at individuals. And I kind of want to transition to a little bit more the population level, or thinking about if somebody is more or less spiritual, more or less religious, what kind of an effect does that have on different measures? So to be concrete, does being more religious or more spiritual lead to better health outcomes?
Um, well, it's interesting. If you do look at large data samples and, they study 2,000, 3,000 people, the general answer has been yes, that people who are more religious, more spiritual as part of their lives tend to do better overall in terms of both their mental and physical health. Now, first of all, the one important caveat is to say that, there's plenty of very religious people who die, young, and there's plenty of atheists who live to 100. So, you can't just take that in one way or the other. The other thing is that, I think part of the answer to the question too is the mechanisms by which this happens. So, I tend to like to refer to the mechanisms by which this may occur as being either direct versus indirect. And by indirect, what I mean is that a lot of people who are religious are doing things as part of their tradition, which have ancillary health benefits. So, for example, just the social interaction, going to a church or a synagogue or whatever, when you're with other people, all, huge amounts of research have shown that those people who have the strongest social support networks do the best as far as their health, mental as well as physical health. So that in and of itself is very important. It's not being religious necessarily, but it's having that group of people who supports you, who can come and help you out, who can do all these things. Another indirect mechanism are dietary changes. And so, for example, if you're a Hindu and you decide to become a vegetarian, a lot of research nowadays shows that people who eat plant-based diets are healthier than people who eat a lot of proteins from meats, especially red meats. So you wind up with a health benefit, not because you're a Hindu, but because you're following a dietary program that you could follow anyway. I mean, anybody can be a vegetarian, and derive that ancillary benefit too. Now, the more direct mechanisms have to do, I think, more with spiritual practices, like meditation and prayer. Like we were just talking about, that they have this beneficial effect on lowering, on regulating your emotions, lowering your stress, anxiety, and that helps to improve your immune system and so forth. And so, I think that there are some very direct mechanisms there. And then the other direct mechanism, which, this is the one that we don't fully know about, although there's an interesting sort of corollary to it, which is, just whether being spiritual has an inherent value for people. And the closest, I think, sort of, corollary to that is that there have been some studies that show that people who are optimistic do better than other people. So, people who think that the world is a good place, that think that outcomes in their life are going to be good, have better health outcomes. And whether or not being a spiritual person makes you more optimistic or has something, like that feeling of positivity and so forth, may have may confer some direct benefit to an individual as part of that process. But again, there's plenty of room for people who are not religious and spiritual, and I think ultimately, even if you don't have a specific tradition that you're going to adhere to, doing things that connect you to the world, that connect you to others, that help you feel creative, that lower your stress, even if it doesn't have to have a supernatural concept, still can be very beneficial for an individual. And that spiritual part of the person, I think, is something that really is something that can be fostered for people, irrespective of what their beliefs are.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, that definitely makes sense. I see we're nearing our time here, so I'm gonna just ask a few quick questions, and we'll get through these. Um, so this one, do you know, is there a relationship between the degree of religiousness in a society and outcomes like I mean, I guess we could go many different directions with this, but maybe health outcomes of the society or economic, or do you know of any of these kind of large scale social effects?
Well, I don't know if anybody's ever done a study to show that, societies that are more religious, survive longer or whatever. Um, I will say this, which to me, I think has always been something that I've noted, is that if you look at human history, um, I'm not aware of any civilization that ever arose without a religious or spiritual perspective, whether it was the Egyptians and the pharaohs, whether it was the gods of Mesopotamia, um, whether it's the Greeks or the Romans. There has always been a religious or spiritual component to that. Now, whether or not that helps to foster a sense of community, a sense of morals, a sense of purpose, not sure. But again, I have rarely, if ever, heard of any civilization that arose without it. I mean, sometimes, as we're seeing in today's world, a lot of countries now, many more people within them are becoming atheists and agnostic and so forth. That's different, but actually arising and forming frequently have been, or almost universally have had, some kind of religious or spiritual component to it. Another way of looking at your question, which is, for the individuals in there, in those societies, it does really depend on sort of how their individual beliefs are aligned with the societal beliefs. So, for example, if you are a Jewish person, if you're living in Israel as a Jewish person, you're probably, if you're a religious person, you're probably going to do pretty well, because there's a correlation between that. If you were a Jewish person living in the old Soviet Union, where you were persecuted for being Jewish, well, then your overall outcomes were much worse, and your level of depression and anxiety and stress and health were much worse. So there is a relationship between the people in a given society and what that society either supports or doesn't support. But the bottom line is that if you're kind of aligned with that belief system, then you're probably going to be doing okay. And if you're not aligned with it, then it's going to be much more problematic for you.
I see. Okay. All right. Well, that definitely makes sense. All right. Well, we'll end on an easy question. I've been
I don't know if
asking.
there are any easy questions in this area.
Well, this is actually totally zooming out. This is about the brain in general, and it is not really an easy question. But I've been asking all my guests, my neuroscientist guests, about what would be your long elevator pitch answer to the question, "How does the brain work?"
Well, um, on one hand, we can look at all of these, neurotransmitters and brain activity patterns and electrical changes and all that. And, we have learned so much about how the brain works and operates. But if you're getting at the question, which I think you're getting, which is similar to what I pose to all my students, I say, well, look, you've got sodium and potassium rushing across the cell membranes. You have neurons activating. You have serotonin and dopamine and other neurotransmitters all flowing back and forth. You have billions and billions of neurons, quadrillions and quadrillions of connections. Where in all of that is your thought? Where in all of that is your mind, your consciousness? And the short answer is we have no idea. So, the big picture would be, can we chip away at that in some way? Can we learn something about where within our brains is our mind, or is the mind and consciousness, as we get into these big philosophical questions, and is it something that is somehow separated from the brain in some way, or what I sometimes like to think is that they're just two different ways of looking at the same thing, and a little bit like the wave particle duality in quantum mechanics. If you kind of look for mental processes, you find this subjective experience, and if you look for biological processes, you can find that with the brain scan. But exactly where and how it all works is still a mystery, and that's what gives all of us something to do for the next 100 years.
Indeed. All
At
right.
least.
Yeah, right. Well, thank you so much for talking with me today. It's been really fascinating, and I can't wait to for your new book. And would you like to kind of tell people where they can find you and all that?
Sure. I mean, the best way to get in touch with me, or to look at our research projects, or learn about the new books and so forth that'll be coming out, is just my website. It's just Andrew Newberg, NEWBERG.com. And they can get all kinds of information. And there's also a way of connecting with me as well.
All right. Fantastic. Thank you again. I'll let you go here, but thanks again.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
All right. Talk to you soon.
All right. Take care.
All right, well, that is it. Thank you so much for listening or watching this episode of the Thinking Tools podcast from Sense of Mind. Be sure to like and subscribe to the YouTube channel and the podcast, and also consider giving this show a 5-star rating on whatever podcast platform you use. As always, this channel is brought to you by the Diamond Mind Foundation. This episode was written and produced by me, Andrew Cooper Sansone. Thank you so much for watching. I'll catch you next time.